All right, well, 2 weeks ago, we embarked on a short series entitled Underrated, in which we're considering a few aspects of the Christian life that are often underrated in their value and significance. And sometimes they're underrated or glossed over because they don't seem as glamorous as other things, such as what we talked about a couple weeks ago on the spiritual gift or the daily practice of encouragement. Doesn't seem like that big of an important deal, considered when some people want to sing and preach and do all the other big things or the showy thing. But in reality, encouragement definitely cannot be overlooked. It is a very powerful spiritual gift. Sometimes, however, they're underrated because they're so uncomfortable or even painful to deal with. Such is our topic for this morning, adversity. And I originally was going to use the word suffering here, but to be honest, adversity kind of covers a whole lot wider territory. And although suffering is a part of our adversity journey, the majority of the challenges that we face or will face are not quite on that level. And truthfully, I'm not a big fan of using words in a way that kind of cheapens the value of the true meaning of it. To use the word suffering, for example, to refer to something that really falls more under the idea of just hardship or adversity or challenges, to me, it's kind of an insult to those that really might be suffering, in my opinion. But that's just kind of the way I am with words sometimes. But the topic of adversity is a difficult one to deal with for many believers. It's often an impossible one to deal with for many unbelievers who can't wrap their minds around the dilemma or the question of how an all-powerful, all-knowing God, who is supposed to be defined by love, can allow the depth of evil and suffering in the world that we often see and even experience. For some, that question is a theological one, or even part of an intellectual pursuit. There are people far more intelligent and far more philosophically and theologically equipped to answer that better than I could when it comes to that. However, to give kind of a somewhat quick, maybe simplified answer to the question, it goes back to free will and the fall in the Garden of Eden. When given the option to make a choice to obey God and trust Him, or to allow Satan to convince him that God was holding something back, Adam and Eve chose the latter. And in doing so, they turned on a faucet that will not be turned off until God shut the whole world down once and for all. They began with a snowball that has been rolling down the hill since that day, a snowball of sin and hardship that has created suffering in this world. Even Romans chapter 8 said, even creation itself groans. But adversity and suffering is not a God-created thing. It is a man-created thing. For many, however, is more, not so much an intellectual or a theological problem, it's an emotional or a personal question. In other words, it comes from a place of why is the evil or suffering or adversity happening to me? Why doesn't God stop it or prevent it from happening to me? And all of us have felt the sting of that question or that dilemma at a time. Often when we're questioning, what we're questioning is the chain of events that led to us becoming the victim of someone else's choices or the circumstances that may lead to our pain. And although misery does love company at times, the fact that there are many other people who might be dealing with the same dilemma or worse isn't really all that comforting in the least. In those moments, no theological or intellectual answer is going to prove helpful or change the situation or make us less emotional about it. What we need in those moments is the presence of friends, the grace and the peace of Christ that assures us that He will be by our side through it all, and perhaps to find some sense of meaning and purpose in the pain. And there are many incredible privileges and advantages, though, that go with choosing to follow Christ and living the Christian life. Some, of course, await us in the life to come, when we get to be with Jesus in eternity. But many of those advantages have to do with the time that we have left here on earth. And as I've matured both in life and in my own spiritual journey, I've learned that one of the most incredible advantages we've inherited as believers filled by the Holy Spirit has been how our perspective on adversity and on pain and on suffering can be reframed or looked at from a completely different perspective than when we live apart from Christ. Instead of seeing adversity as this uncomfortable, necessary evil that we just have to put up with, I've learned that if we ask the right questions, if we begin to see it from God's point of view, then we can learn how adversity and suffering can play a critical role, not only in our own personal development as a believer, but even play a significant role in bringing others into a relationship with God. And let's be honest, isn't that the ultimate goal? I'd like to challenge you this morning to ask yourself the question that I've asked myself as I've thought about this topic now for the last 2 weeks, and then just kind of keep an open mind as you consider some of the answers. And the question is simply this: Is there anything positive, anything to be gained from having adversity or experiencing suffering in this life? It's a tough question to ask. It's a question most people don't ask. They just go immediately to the emotional detachment from it. But when you really begin to think about that question from a biblical perspective, it's amazing some of the things that might come to mind. You might discover that adversity and even suffering, as uncomfortable as it may seem, may just be a very underrated and valuable part of our journey. And this morning I want to share with you some of the thoughts that I feel that God has laid on my heart as I thought about this question, some of the answers that kind of came to my mind. The first thing that came to mind when wondering what good can come from adversity or suffering is the simple truth that suffering awakens or sharpens our spiritual awareness or sensitivity. In other words, it makes most people begin to at least think about God, even if not in a good light at first. C.S. Lewis had famously said that suffering is God's megaphone to get our attention sometimes. More accurately, he wrote this: pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasure, speaks to us in our conscience, but he shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. No doubt pain as God's megaphone is a terrible instrument. It may lead to final and unrepented rebellion, but it gives the only opportunity that some bad men can have for amendment. It removes the veil. It plants the flag of truth within the fortress of the rebel soul. The question is, how do you choose to respond to the problem of pain and suffering, or on a broader scale, the idea of adversity? And one blog writer I came across wrote this: that some conclude that the suffering of the righteous makes faith in the loving, powerful God impossible. But others conclude the suffering of the righteous makes faith in the loving, powerful God imperative. To me, the first response only deepens a sense of hopelessness in the despair, while the latter props up a hope on a foundation of assurance. I choose to believe that it is imperative. If one is open to the fact that there is indeed deep purpose in their suffering, it paves the road that leads to salvation. But hey, don't take my word for it. Instead, take the word of this very famous actor and comedian whose own suffering led to his own spiritual awakening.
And ultimately, I believe that suffering leads to salvation. And in fact, it's the only way. That we have to somehow accept and not deny, but feel our suffering and feel our losses, and then we make one of two decisions. We either decide to go through the gate of resentment, which leads to vengeance, which leads to self-harm, which leads to harm to others, or we go through the gate of forgiveness, which leads to grace. And your being here is an indication that you've made that decision already. You've made the decision to walk through the gate of forgiveness to grace, just as Christ did on the cross. He suffered terribly, and he was broken by it to the point of doubt and a feeling of absolute abandonment, which all of you felt. And then there was a decision to be made. And the decision was to look upon the people who were causing that suffering, or the situation that was causing that suffering, with compassion and with forgiveness. And that's what opens the gates of heaven for all of us.
For those of you who don't know, that Jim Carrey, he was the star of Bruce Almighty and quite a few other movies. But he has had a lot of mental struggles and stuff, and he finally came to a point where he realized that suffering was leading him to Christ. So even though for some, suffering just deepens doubt and cements an already hard heart against God, for others it can ultimately lead to salvation or a deeper dependence on God, especially when they come to understand that he did not even shield his own son from adversity or suffering, as Jim Carrey mentioned. But God doesn't just allow adversity or suffering for the sake of raising the awareness of unbelievers, but also to strengthen the faith and the trust of those who believe in his power to work through their challenges. In 2 Corinthians, Paul testified to an uncomfortable inconvenience in his own life, referring to it as a thorn in the flesh. It was bothersome enough for him to pray multiple times for God to exempt him from it. But God said no. In fact, the response from Jesus' own mouth was that in this weakness, that the power and the strength of Christ was revealed more vividly. Sorry, I meant to put that scripture up there and I didn't. But it is through adversity and suffering that God's glory is often revealed. You may recall a situation in John 9 when the disciples came upon a man who had been born blind. And in line with the traditional way of thinking in that culture, the disciples asked who had sinned in such a way to cause that this man would be blind. Was it himself or were his parents sin that caused this? What was the reason? And remember the answer that Jesus gave? He said it was none of the above, nothing like that. Instead, the man's blindness was an opportunity for God to be glorified, he said. In that particular man's case, God's glory was revealed through a miraculous healing. But that's not the case for most people in that situation. The more common way for God to be glorified is, as Paul stated, God's power made manifest in our weakness or our limitations. And for some, they not only become an instrument for God's glory, but they also find their ultimate purpose through their suffering. But again, don't take my word for it. That's the observation of Johnny Erickson Santata, who said that God often used our deepest pain as a launching pad for our greatest calling. Now, for those of you who do not know who this is, she is a special example that comes along for once in a lifetime that profoundly illustrates how God can be glorified through someone's physical or mental challenges. She's a Christian speaker and evangelist who from 1970 on has written over 40 books, made multiple albums, spoken to thousands if not millions, has served on the American Council for Disabilities under 2 different presidents, starred in an autobiographical movie about herself, and has painted countless pictures by holding a paintbrush in her mouth. She does so because as a teenager in 1967, she dove into a shallow part of Chesapeake Bay and became permanently paralyzed. She's now 74 years old, then she was 17. After a period of struggle and depression, instead of blaming God, she clung to him, and in so doing, she found her calling. Listen to this as she sings a special song that she wrote about God's presence with her in the moments of adversity.
Yet not alone. God's the light that will guide me home. With his love and tenderness, leading through the wilderness, and wherever I may roam, I'm alone, yet not alone. I will not be bent in fear. The refuge I know is near. In his strength I find my own. By his faithfulness he showed that so mighty is his shield. For his love is now revealed. When my steps are lost and desperate for a guide, I can feel his touch, a soothing presence by my
See, many people are greatly moved when they see something extraordinary that defies normal rationalization or behavior. Although she didn't have to do it in that song, many of the songs that she sings, when she hits high notes, her husband, Ken Totter, who she's been married to for 40 years now, has to hold her chest in a certain way or to hold her diaphragm so she can hit those high notes. But she never falters in her faith to God. She's followed him relentlessly over the last 56, 57 years. When a believer undergoing great adversity or suffering endures or persists beyond normal human levels or beyond explanation, people take note of that and are moved to at least consider the why and the how behind it. His power is made perfect in our weakness, particularly in the midst of our adversity and our suffering, partly because in those moments we look the most like Jesus. Along that line, another critical aspect of adversity and suffering is that it does indeed help us to further identify with Jesus and become more like him. We cannot be conformed to the likeness of Jesus without going through some of the same things that he went through, including the suffering and the trials and the temptation. Mother Teresa once said that pain and suffering have come into our life, but remember, pain, sorrow, suffering are but the kiss of Jesus, a sign that you have come so close to him that he can kiss you. Now, I don't know that I would build a theology around that statement, but Jesus did say, "Blessed are you when others revile you or persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for they so persecuted the prophets who were before you." As Hebrews 11, sometimes known as the Hall of Faith, reminds us, none of God's people are exempt from adversity or suffering, but there is great purpose in it, a glorious purpose. And speaking specifically of the work of the apostles as they were spreading the gospel under trying circumstances, in 2 Corinthians 4, Paul wrote something that many of us have taken to heart when it comes to adversity in our own journey. He wrote, "We are pressed on every side by troubles, but we are not crushed. We are perplexed, but we're not driven to despair. We are hunted down, but never abandoned by God. We get knocked down, but we are not destroyed. Through suffering, our bodies continue to share in the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be seen in our bodies." He went on to write a few verses later that all of this is for the benefit of those who are observing. He says, "God's grace reaches more and more people, and there will be great thanksgiving, and God will receive more and more glory. That is why we never give up. Though our bodies are dying, our spirits are being renewed every single day. For our present troubles are small and won't last very long, yet they produce for us a glory that vastly outweighs them and will last forever." So we don't look at the troubles that we can see now. Rather, we fix our gaze on things that cannot be seen. For the things we see now will soon be gone, but the things we cannot see will last forever. Paul wrote a similar conclusion about suffering in Romans 8 when he said, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us," and I would say revealed in us as well. Adversity and suffering increases our longing for our eternal heavenly home. And I think sometimes God allows a situation to come our way just to remind us to long for the right thing. In the meantime, one of the most important values of adversity and suffering is what it does to prepare us for that heavenly home. It develops character within us by stretching our capacity for resilience and faithfulness and obedience. That's exactly what Paul wrote in Romans 5, beginning in verse 3. He says, "We can rejoice too, because when we run into problems and trials, we know that they help us to develop endurance. And endurance develops strength of character. And character strengthens our confident hope of salvation. And this hope will kind of spiritual mindset. In a passage most of us are familiar with, James, the half-brother of Jesus, wrote the same kind of rhetoric in James chapter 1. "For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. If any of you approach, and it will be given to him." And to add one more highly respected voice in this matter for good measure, check out Peter's words in 1 Peter 1. He says, "So be truly glad. There is wonderful. These trials will show that your faith is genuine. It is being tested as fire tests and purifies gold. Though your faith is strong through many trials. It will bring you much praise and glory and honor on the day when Jesus Christ is revealed. Psalm 119. And one of the verses in that psalm, you might recall, says, your statutes. Solomon wrote in Proverbs 17:3 that the crucible is for silver and the furnace is. Though we have endured trials of all kinds, our faith is no more than a cognitive belief on farming. It is developed in the soil of life. And we all know what that is, right? And that's what adversity is for us. In us. We cannot know love at the highest level until we have experienced what it means to be unloved, or even experience that which seeks to break our spirit. Last nerve. We cannot know true kindness and gentleness and the harshness of others that would make us want to unleash upon them. As God flipped the script in our favor if we let him. In fact, Satan intends to use that by Christ in us, it can bring out the best in us. Well, to build us up. And in addition, credibility. When it comes to speaking about the power of God to overcome anything that life, road to adversity, or of God's assurance who are going through their own adversity and wondering if God really is the answer. Solidifies our credibility to speak into the for empathy and compassion. Paul said it this way in the beginning of 2 Corinthians 1. He said, God has given us with comfort through Christ. More comfort and salvation. You. And then that as you share in our sufferings, you also believe that one of the our own experience help comfort others. And empath. Some wars have to be fought to be. Christian journey, one that is often experiencing a suffering. Righteous. That is not biblical. God is using it in some way. I can't imagine. I believe he is. His name is to recovery after I can't even begin to with men with scepters